Right, so have you heard about this book, The Sympathizer? It won a Pulitzer. It's by Viet, Thanh, and Nguyen, and it's set during the Vietnam War.
Oh yeah, The Sympathizer. It's quite a powerful book, not just in terms of like its writing, but also in how it really digs into some tough stuff about war, identity, even the American dream.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, like, is this just another Vietnam War story, or?
Not even close. Imagine like historical fiction mixed with a spy thriller, and then somebody throws in this dark humor that just catches you off guard. It's a wild ride.
Okay, that sounds way more interesting than what I had pictured. Who would you say this book is really for, though?
It's for people who like, books that make you think, that stick with you. After you finish the last page, you're still thinking about it. So if you're into the Vietnam War or stories about immigrants or just honestly any book that really gets deep into what it means to be human, The Sympathizer is going to grab you.
I can definitely see the appeal, but I've also heard it's a pretty difficult read. Like, not exactly light beach reading.
You're not wrong. It's a book that demands your attention. Structurally, linguistically, Nguyen makes you work for it. He writes these super intricate sentences, like layers upon layers, so you can't just skim it. But honestly, that's part of why it's so good. It's like, savoring every bite of a gourmet meal. You got to take your time to appreciate the nuances.
So what's the hook? What makes this book so different that I should add it to my reading list?
Well, the whole story is told by this, get this, a communist double agent, you never learn his name, and he's this mixed race guy, half French, half Vietnamese, completely torn between two worlds. And right from the beginning, he's writing a confession. That sets the stage for the whole book. You know it's going to be intense.
A confession? So does that mean?
Oh yeah, there are definitely consequences for the choices he makes. But it's not just the plot that pulls you in, it's how Nguyen tells the story. He uses these really striking metaphors, especially when he's talking about the violence of war.
Like what? Give me an example.
So there is this one where he compares grenades to, and this is going to sound weird, short metallic dildos.
Whoa. Okay, yeah, not your typical war imagery.
Exactly. But that's Nguyen, He pushes boundaries, he makes you see things in a whole new light. And then there's this other line I love. He talks about waking up in the perineum of time, that groggy in-between zone from late night to early morning.
Yeah, I kind of get what he means, but how does that fit into the whole story?
It shows his dark humor, but it also tells you something about the narrator's mindset. He's tired of the world, cynical, and haunted by everything he's seen.
I'm sensing this isn't your typical war hero story.
No, not at all. This guy is flawed, morally complicated, and always struggling with who he really is. That internal battle, that's the core of the book.
And being a double agent definitely adds to that whole moral dilemma, right?
Absolutely. Imagine having to betray everyone you're close to, living a lie constantly, all for a cause you're not even sure you believe in anymore. That's what our narrator's dealing with, and it creates some seriously tense and emotional situations.
So it sounds like this book really tackles some heavy topics. What about the content itself? Does it get really emotionally draining?
It can be intense. Nguyen doesn't shy away from the ugliness of war or the damage it does to people and societies. There's one scene, the evacuation from Saigon, that a reviewer said was like something out of Apocalypse Now. You really feel the panic, the desperation, the sheer terror as people are trying to escape.
And you mentioned something about re-education camps earlier.
Right. These were basically prison camps run by the North Vietnamese government after the war. Their purpose was to re-educate, people who had supported the South Vietnamese government. The descriptions of what went on in those camps are brutal, really disturbing stuff.
So it sounds like The Sympathizer really digs into the darkness of war, not just the battles, but also the aftermath.
Absolutely. It makes you confront the cost of conflict, the scars it leaves on people and whole nations. But even with all that darkness, Nguyen still manages to weave in moments of brilliance, even humor, and sometimes even hope. It's amazing how he can blend humor and tragedy, often in the same sentence. It's a real roller coaster, emotionally, but that's also what keeps you glued to the page.
We were talking about the darker parts of the war. Does the whole book just stay in Vietnam, or does it go beyond that?
It goes way beyond. A lot of the book is actually about the Vietnamese refugee experience in America. The narrator and the general he's spying on, they both end up in Los Angeles. They're trying to rebuild their lives, along with a whole community or other South Vietnamese refugees.
Oof, that's got to be tough.
Yeah.
Trying to fit into a new culture while you're still dealing with the trauma of war and loss.
For sure. And Nguyen captures that sense of displacement so well. There's the scene where a bunch of refugees are having a party and they're talking about the food they used to eat back in Vietnam. It's not just about missing the food, it's about missing everything that food represents. Their memories, their community, the feeling of belonging, all the stuff they had to leave behind.
So that theme of identity, the struggle to belong, it sounds like that runs deep in this book.
It's everywhere, woven into the whole narrative. The narrator being mixed race and having all these divided loyalties, he's always trying to figure out who he is, where he belongs. Is he Vietnamese? American? Can he be both? And being a double agent, that just makes that whole inner conflict even more intense.
It's like he's a walking challenge to the idea that things are black and white, that they're easy answers.
Exactly. And McGreen uses this character to really expose the hypocrisy, the double standards in American society. You remember Mrs. Mori, the Japanese-American secretary? She's a really strong voice in the book, calling out all this stuff about how immigrants are treated. She talks about how there's all this pressure for immigrants to assimilate, to become Americanized, but at the same time, they're facing discrimination, being seen as outsiders. There's this one line, she compares herself to John F. Kennedy. She's like, did anyone ever question his Irish heritage? Did they make him learn to speak Gaelic?
Wow, that's a good point. It really highlights that double standard, how belonging and acceptance are so much more complex than people think.
And then things get even more interesting when the narrator gets involved in making a Hollywood movie about the Vietnam War. You know, like one of those big budget war epics, kind of like Apocalypse Now.
Oh, wow. So he's actually having to deal with how his own history is being portrayed on screen.
Right. He's hired as a consultant on the film, and he's immediately struck by how the Vietnamese characters are being depicted. They're either stereotypes, really flat and one-dimensional, or they're just completely pushed aside so the white American heroes can take center stage.
That sounds like a pretty harsh critique of how Hollywood often twists history around to make it more entertaining.
It is, and it brings up that really important question of who gets to tell the story, whose voices are being heard, and whose are being silenced.
It's kind of like what we were talking about earlier with The Quiet American and how it shows the Vietnam War from a completely different perspective, not the typical American one. Are there any other books that you think connect with the sympathizer in that way?
Yeah, definitely. There are some books with similar themes, like Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness comes to mind. Both of them really delve into the psychological impact of imperialism, and they have characters who are caught between different ideologies, forced to make choices where there's no clear right or wrong answer.
That moral ambiguity, that struggle with what's right and wrong, it seems like a key part of the sympathizer.
Totally. The narrator, he's not a traditional hero. He's got flaws, he makes mistakes, he even does some pretty terrible things. But that's what makes him feel so real, so human. He makes us think about the hard choices people make when their survival is on the line.
So it sounds like this is the kind of book that stays with you long after you finished reading it. What would you say to someone who's on the fence about picking it up? Maybe because of the heavy subject matter or because they've heard it's a challenging read?
I'd tell them The Sympathizer is a book that will challenge you, it will move you, and it will definitely make you see the world in new ways. It's not a light read, but it's incredibly rewarding.
You've definitely made me curious about it. What would you say is the most striking thing about the book for you?
One of the things that really fascinates me is how Nguyen plays with the idea of memory. The whole book is a confession, but it's also a way for the narrator to come to terms with his past, to try to make sense of everything he's been through.
That's a really interesting point. It makes me think about how we understand history, whose memories are given priority, whose stories get told, and whose get left out.
Exactly. And I think The Sympathizer is a powerful reminder that we should be questioning the narratives we encounter, looking for different perspectives, and always thinking critically about how history is being presented to us.
So we've covered a lot. We've talked about the book's unique writing style, the complex themes it explores, the historical context it brings to life. But what about the overall message? What do you think Nguyen is ultimately trying to say with this book?
That's a really deep question, and I don't think there's just one simple answer. I mean, on one level, The Sympathizer is like this powerful statement against war, period. It shows you the brutality, the way it dehumanizes people, the trauma that lingers, for individuals and for whole societies. But it goes way beyond just showing us how awful war is.
Right, because we're seeing it all through the eyes of this character who's not so easy to label as a good guy or a bad guy. He's somewhere in between, navigating both sides.
Exactly. Nguyen is giving a voice to the Vietnamese experience, which is something that often gets left out or pushed to the side in the stories we usually hear about the Vietnam War. He's making us confront how complicated this conflict really was, to see it from a perspective that's not just the American one.
And he's doing it with this blend of sharp wit and really unsettling imagery. I can't get that grenade metaphor out of my head, and shocking, yeah. But it's also got this darkly funny side to it that tells you something about how the narrator sees the world.
That's what makes Nguyen's writing so brilliant. He uses that dark humor to show us the absurdity of war, but also to point out how trauma can mess with our perceptions and force us to face things we'd rather not see.
You've mentioned a few times now this concept of the sympathizer, this double agent who's straddling two worlds. What do you think that character represents in the bigger picture of the book?
To me, he represents the struggle of trying to figure out who you are, especially when you're caught between different cultures, different belief systems, different loyalties. He's constantly trying to make all these pieces of himself fit together, but it's a fight that ends up having some really destructive consequences.
So it's like a warning about the dangers of having divided loyalties.
Maybe, but it also makes me think about how empathy, the ability to understand someone else, can show up in the most unexpected places. Even though this character does some awful things, you still see glimpses of his humanity, his compassion, even his desire to connect with others.
It sounds like Nguyen is challenging us to move past simple judgments, to really grapple with the complexity of what it means to be human.
For sure. The Sympathizer doesn't give you easy answers or neat endings. It pushes you to face uncomfortable truths, to examine your own biases, and to accept that human nature isn't always black and white.
Well, you've given us a lot to think about. Any parting thoughts for our listeners who are now trying to decide whether to take the plunge and dive into the sympathizer themselves?
If you want a book that will make you think, make you question things, and stay with you long after you've finished it, then The Sympathizer is absolutely worth checking out.
It seems like it's more than just a war story. It's a deep exploration of identity, memory, and how powerful stories can be.
Exactly. It's a book that will make you think, make you feel, and in the end, make you see the world a little differently.
Thanks so much for taking us on this journey through The Sympathizer. It's been a fascinating conversation.
It's been my pleasure. Enjoy the book, everyone.